Thanks so much, Alvaro, and thanks to GlobeScan for organizing this event. My name is Jenny Vaughn. I direct the human rights team at BSR. I'm really honored to moderate the conversation over the next hour, talking about business in conflict-affected areas. We are going to be using Ukraine as a key example of looking at the kinds of human rights dilemmas that arise in conflict-affected areas and talking a little bit about what businesses and their partners in civil society and the public sector can be doing to prepare for the next crisis. I am honored to be joined by a few great colleagues here. I will be handing over in a moment to my colleague, Kayla Winarski-Green. She is a human rights manager at BSR. And then we're lucky enough to be joined by two colleagues from UN Global Compact, Michelle Breslauer, she is the Senior Manager for Global Governance, and Alina Konovalchenko, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Global Compact Network Ukraine. We will be joined by a few colleagues from Peace Nexus as well, Johanna Schroeder, the Business Engagement Lead, as well as Daniela Bosniak, who is the Program Advisor there. So let me talk a bit about what we are going to talk about. We have a few key messages that we really want you all to hear today. The first is that, of course, businesses face heightened risk of causing, contributing, or being otherwise complicit in human rights abuses when they operate in conflict-affected areas like Ukraine. And of course, they have a responsibility under the international standard, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to respect human rights by ensuring they understand how they impact people and then taking steps to try to manage those impacts, particularly focusing on negative impacts. So in a moment, we will be looking at Ukraine as a case study, looking at the kinds of human rights risks and dilemmas that have come up there, looking at how business has responded. And then we'll be talking as well about the steps that companies can take to foster an enabling environment for peace and stability. So before we dive into Ukraine in particular, I just want to set the scene a little bit. I've already said that human rights risks are amplified in conflict-affected contexts. And when I'm talking about conflict-affected contexts, we certainly mean places like Ukraine, which has seen a significant military invasion. But we're also talking about places where we see civil conflict, community conflict between different ethnic or religious groups. And we also see places where violence has yet to break out, but where there's risk factors like significant climate disasters, like weak rule of law, like high levels of corruption. All of those factors can make a context at risk of conflict and violence breaking out. And when a business is operating in these kinds of contexts, it is more likely that they will be linked to harms. So that could be risks like impacts on the safety and security of their staff in the area. It can be attacks on human rights defenders, people standing up for human rights in the areas where companies are working. It can include things like illegitimate internet shutdowns or censorship online. And then companies, of course, in addition to being linked to these higher levels of harm, they actually can be themselves exposed to greater levels of interference, to co-option, and to complicity in human rights abuses. So what, therefore, should companies be doing? The core concept here is that businesses are not neutral. When they arrive in a place like Ukraine or any other country around the world, they are entering into a pre-existing context, and they influence that context by the way they do business. That could be through their hiring decisions, through their procurement decisions, decisions about where they site operations or infrastructure, and critically, through their business relationships, the support that they might be offering to state-owned enterprises, to government entities, and to local business. And I should clarify that this is relevant across industries. I think historically people think about extractives, mining companies really being the ones that are exposed to the risks of violence. But in fact, it's, of course, across value chains, across industries, and of course, across contexts. as I mentioned before, businesses have a responsibility under the UN guiding principles to respect human rights. And what that means is they should be taking steps to manage adverse impacts on people that result from their business activity. Because these human rights risks are heightened in conflict affected areas, there's an expectation that businesses will do what's called heightened human rights due diligence or enhanced human rights due diligence. Human rights due diligence is essentially a process of companies identifying their impacts on people, their human rights risks and impacts, and then taking steps to put in place measures that will prevent and mitigate any adverse impacts, that they will then track how effective this is, and then they will report out on this so that they're transparent about the impact that they're having on people and the steps that they're taking to prevent and mitigate those impacts. So what we see in high-risk contexts or conflict-affected areas like Ukraine is that companies should be taking enhanced steps to doing that. And that essentially means accounting for context, accounting for the business's impact on the context. And it really requires ongoing stakeholder engagement. It requires being forward-looking about tracking trends and monitoring the context, being proactive, being prepared, and being very localized in decision-making. There's one other point I just want to mention here, which is that in a high-risk context, such as Ukraine and other high-risk contexts around the world, it's not sufficient to mitigate risks that result directly from the business's activities. Companies should also be thinking about how their impact on the context might increase human rights harms. And so companies can exacerbate some of those existing dynamics through, again, pathways like hiring and procurement practices and those partnerships with local entities. The risk of partnering with certain local entities, such as government in high-risk contexts or highly corrupt contexts, is that it will confer legitimacy on those actors or provide them with financial resources. So I'm just going to touch briefly on some of these key categories of what enhanced human rights due diligence looks like on the next slide to give a sense of what we do expect that companies will do in these high-risk contexts. And I will, in a moment, actually post a link so that you all can access some of this information in some recent reports that BSR has put out. But essentially, what we want to see companies do is conducting enhanced human rights due diligence, really, first of all, making sure they understand where they are operating that is considered to be high risk so that they can be prepared with contingency plans before the next crisis breaks out. We know that stakeholder engagement, knowing who different actors are on the ground, speaking with representatives of different types of communities, particularly vulnerable communities or historically disadvantaged communities, that kind of ongoing communication is also really critical to ensuring that companies understand how they are impacting people, but it's also really critical to ensure that they have information about how to manage those impacts. That preparation is really key. Most crises are not surprises. We can actually anticipate by looking at certain indicators that conflict is more or less likely to break out in the near term. And so companies ideally, again, are thinking about, well, where do we have supply chains or an operational footprint that might be high risk? And what should we do in those places in the event of an invasion, in the event of intercommunal strife breaking out? What kinds of steps should we take to protect our employees or the communities that are living in the areas where we have a presence? And then finally, of course, we do want to see that at the corporate level, companies are working really closely with their local colleagues on the ground so that they are decentralizing that decision-making. They're ensuring that their local colleagues have those relationships that enable them to monitor the context and plan for what they should do in the event that a crisis breaks out. So that is a bit of a rapid, high-level overview of business and conflict, what we hope businesses will do when they find themselves in a place where crisis has broken out, or what they can do to prepare a bit in advance. What I'd like to do now is hand over to my colleague, Kayla Winarski-Green. She will be, again, looking at what has happened in Ukraine, providing a bit of an overview of what the international business response has been to date, and what kinds of dilemmas we're seeing those international businesses confronting. Kayla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for this background and very helpful information, and to all of you for tuning in today. So with that background in mind, we wanted to provide you with a brief overview from our account on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're well aware of the fact that everyone in this room right now has full knowledge of what is going on, but we wanted to be very clear when we're starting to have these conversations that this is not a new thing or a random occurrence, but rather the most high-stakes situation for the country since breaking from the Soviet Union in 1991, and the continuation of an occupation that began in 2014. We're focusing on the activities that have occurred since February 2022, during which Putin essentially denied Ukrainian statehood, and wanted to situate this within human rights framing. This has created what has been called the swiftest refugee exodus of the century, the largest military operation in Europe since the end of World War II. We want to be very clear in stating that Russia is violating international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, and a host of agreements. Some of the human rights that we've found violations of include the right to life, freedom from torture, right to freedom of expression, a right to cultural heritage, and the right to food, freedom from hunger, etc. Several organizations like Human Rights Watch and the New York Times are now compiling archives of war crimes by Russia against Ukraine, and we've seen organizations like the OSCE report on violations of international humanitarian law. So this is something that we keep in the back of our minds when we discuss the business response and the implications globally. In terms of what we're seeing in Ukraine, we have noted an uptick of over 7.3 million border crossings, most of which are Ukrainians seeking refuge. There's also been a rise in civilian volunteers and paramilitary groups. And we have seen President Zelensky refusing to leave the country, but instead imploring the EU to grant Ukraine membership. He's also used several opportunities to implore the global community and the business world to increase sanctions and actions against Moscow. One final note when we speak about these human rights abuses is to be very explicit that different people are experiencing these human rights abuses and trauma differently. Namely, people belonging to marginalized groups are now facing overlapping systems of oppression. For example, we've seen reports that African and Caribbean residents of Ukraine who are fleeing the country are experiencing racism and discrimination. We've seen the same for South Asian residents. We have seen elderly Ukrainians being trapped and experiencing isolation, and Jewish Ukrainians experiencing anti-Semitism and re-traumatization based on claims, Russia's claims of denazifying Ukraine, the strike of Holocaust memorials, and the use of Holocaust disinformation. We also note major implications for women who are experiencing a risk of sexual violence and human trafficking, which is something that several peer organizations have been focusing on. In terms of how the global community is responding, we are seeing a huge response across the world, particularly in the global north and west. We note that out of 193 UN member states, 141 have condemned Russia. All Western countries essentially are taking economic measures, and very recently, the G7 nations have pledged to ban or phase out Russian oil, which has had major implications. In the EU, we have seen travel bans, asset freezes, the prohibition of funds to Putin and his allies. We've seen major financial sector sanctions, limiting access to EU capital and markets, and restrictions on trade. In the field of energy and extractives, we have seen a ban on the export of specific refining technologies, a partial ban on Russian oil imports, and transport sector sanctions. We have also seen some more creative sanctions, like on the use of dual-use goods and the access to technology. Here in the United States, we have seen a major prohibition on financial transactions to some of Russia's largest banks. We have seen large debt and equity prohibitions, and we have seen the sanctioning and cutting off of several members of Putin's elite. And of course, we can't discuss international diplomatic response without highlighting that Russia is being cut off from SWIFT and unable to use those banking resources. But the key focus of our presentation and conversation has been how the international business community has responded to Russia's invasion. We recently hit the milestone of over 1,000 companies acting, exiting, and suspending from the region. What I'm going to discuss today is not an overview of those 1,000 companies, but rather some of the major trends that we've observed among them. We've split it into 3 different buckets, companies that are either leaving the region, companies that are trying to help in Ukraine, and the specific role of tech and social media companies, all of which I'll speak through today. In terms of this first trend that I noted, suspending services and exiting the region, we have seen companies acting in creative ways to not do business or exit the region, but also make certain carve-outs for staff or people impacted. For example, the Inter-IKEA group has paused their import and export from both Russia and Belarus, pausing production, but they're keeping Mega, which is the grocery and pharmacies that they open so that people can still have access to goods which are essential for human rights, food, groceries, and pharmacies. Another interesting dilemma we observed was Netflix, which chose to defy Russian law and face a lawsuit there by not adding Russian channels in the country. They had shared that this was a decision that they made knowing full well the legal ramifications because they wanted to avoid potentially being complicit in sharing Russian propaganda. Recently, McDonald's closed all of its restaurants in the region, but continued to pay its employees there. However, about a week or 2 ago, a local Siberian franchisee purchased all of these McDonald's locations and then reopened them under a new logo and a new name. And observers have estimated that this might be a sign of things to come, a sort of second economy that will occur because of these actions. In the financial sector, we've seen broad sweeping divestments from the region, either sort of local comptrollers like in New York City, which is calling to divest pension plans from Russia, BlackRock suspending the purchase of securities, or certain other PE or investment firms, which are all divesting from the region. We have seen companies in joint ventures like Equinor, Shell, and BP all exiting those relationships and also withdrawing from the country. Volkswagen, Volvo, Scania have taken the same steps to suspend their services. Interestingly, and a conversation that we've had with some of our member companies, is several jewelry companies leaving the Responsible Jewelry Council, a coalition, because it hadn't taken any action on Russia, was still allowing Russian companies into the consortium, which they then pivoted on, and the executive director has resigned. So we've seen some of these sort of broader advocacy moves as well. In terms of some of the positive actions that companies have taken, we have observed sort of your garden variety charitable donation, which is not sort of the primary action that we would suggest under a human rights-based approach, but we have seen it coupled with other actions at the same time. So companies like Pfizer, who because of their provision of essential life-saving services decided not to exit the region entirely, have instead taken actions like redirecting all of the profits from their Russian subsidiary to relief efforts in Ukraine. So we see companies making these difficult choices when it's not so clear-cut to leave the region, to still continue to take these actions so that they're not, as Jenny said, being complicit or aiding this regime. We've also seen companies that are halting services or exiting the region, like Pandora, Levi's, and Canada Goose, who were also making these charitable donations. At the same time, we have seen companies using their own business model, their core business, to support the Ukrainian people. So several telecoms companies, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, etc., are waiving charges and allowing long distance calling with Ukraine. We have seen organizations like Airbnb working to host refugees within their homes and also partnering with UN organizations to support the refugees. Speaking of pharmaceutical companies, we've also seen Bayer, who has not only made financial donations, but also shipped medical supplies and antibiotics to their patients in Ukraine and setting up programming there. We have also seen companies trying to contribute to the peace and security process by using their expertise to provide digital support. So Microsoft is supporting the Ukrainian, US, NATO, and EU efforts to identify and defend against cyber attacks, and also suspending sales within the region. We see SpaceX expanding its Starlink satellite internet service to Ukraine to help secure communications between the government and people. And we have also seen portfolio company EQT not only pulling out of the region, but helping with heightened security measures with its private equity peers, aiming to create this cohesive and supportive environment. Finally, we have seen action from social media companies, which we call the rapidly evolving role, because this is something that changes quite frequently and quite quickly. But we've seen companies like Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, Twitter, all announcing measures to stop Russian state media from advertising on their platforms. And in many cases, they don't have a policy suggesting that they do this. This is action they had taken in response to the invasion and sort of stuck to since then. We have seen companies like Google and Meta restricting access to Russian state media outlets. Finally, we have seen social media companies being very cognizant of managing the content on their platform, resisting efforts by Russian internet to get content removed, stepping up fact-checking, and removing covert influence operations. So again, the response by global businesses has been overwhelming, but this is some of the trends that we've observed. And based on these trends and what we already know about the invasion, we have collaborated with our futurist colleagues to put together this list of implications for businesses. Within the sphere of climate and energy transition, we of course know that energy will be costly and supplies are variable because of the global reliance on Russian oil and gas. We see this as a crossroads for governments and for companies to, on one hand, move towards clean energy, or on the other side, drill down and continue working with domestic fossil fuels. So this really presents an opportunity to move forward. Within the sphere of supply chain, something that was already hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic, this is something that is expected to worsen and continue, particularly for food, commodities, and logistics. This is something both incidental and deliberate. As we mentioned previously, Russia's violation of the right to food. We note as well that the risk of Russian cybersecurity attacks could make this situation even worse and could increase the risk. We see major geopolitical risk along with the realignment of alliances as countries align themselves on one hand with Russia, or of course speaking out against the human rights abuses. We see this particularly for China, which is leading to conflict with the West and having major implications for its role with Taiwan. And we also see implications for Western Europe because of this geopolitical rivalry, and Eastern Europe, who are fearing a similar invasion. Of course, there are major implications for human rights, particularly for businesses, the question of whether to suspend or exit the region, implications there, the propensity for corporate activism, questions on whether to support employees, and questions of whether companies like the Netflix example that we cited earlier could be acting beyond legal compliance. Finally, there's much in the air, and we see long-term implications for political responses to the conflict, how this will impact trade, geopolitics, energy, climate, finance, and democracy and corporate citizenship. So in short, this is a major turning point, and we see huge implications for businesses going forward. In terms of how to respond to the crisis and some of these dilemmas that we highlighted earlier, BSR has put together 11 recommendations, all of which we could spend a much longer time talking about and are happy to discuss bilaterally. But for the purpose of today's conversation, primarily we list the need to protect staff. This is absolutely paramount. If you stay in the region, if you exit, this is the core responsibility of companies. Companies can also use their voice and activism to express support for the rule of law. We encourage companies to reconsider criteria for operating in this environment, whether it's necessary or whether responsible exit would be more appropriate. As Jenny mentioned earlier, companies are encouraged to consider their potential complicity should they remain in the region, whether through public procurement or partnering with local entities. We encourage companies to support relief efforts, like some of the examples we listed earlier, to stay focused on climate and not use this as an opportunity to just focus on domestic fuel supplies because of this crossroads that we mentioned, to be transparent and support information collection when this becomes relevant, to undertake heightened human rights due diligence, which Jenny had mentioned previously and which I'll speak further about, to prepare for future threats to business. This is how you respond in this situation is critical going forward, to support targeted economic sanctions, and of course, when taking all of these actions, to engage a broad range of impacted stakeholders. So finally, I'm going to speak very briefly about this tool that BSR has put together to help guide human rights due diligence during situations of political and armed conflict. We have put together this guidance document for companies to use essentially as a conversation to help understand their approach to acting during situations of political and armed conflict, in which companies both take advantage of the situation, look at who is impacted, who is a part of it, look at how company policies, processes, and procedures could be empowering or allowing the company to take further action, guiding external consultation that companies could have to arrive at this decision, and finally putting together an action plan for steps going forward, whether this is to exit in a responsible manner or to continue doing business again in a responsible manner. These are the types of questions that companies should be asking themselves in order to continue with their operations in lieu of political and armed conflict that's ongoing. So I think we can send a link in the chat for further information on this, but just to highlight that human rights due diligence process is absolutely essential during times of political and armed conflict.
Thanks a lot, Keila. And I did drop links to some of the reports that I mentioned on business and conflict affected areas, as well as this rapid human rights due diligence tool for situations of armed conflict. And that is on the GlobeScan main site, where perhaps you are all watching this webinar. So with that, I think I would love to hand over to Michelle and Alina. They, again, are from UN Global Compact, and we're looking forward to them offering a very localized perspective on impacts on business in Ukraine and what kinds of responses they would like to see now and into the future in similar contexts.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks to GlobeScan and to BSR for having us both here. And I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction first to the UN Global Compact for everybody who's tuning in today, and speak a bit about how we are thinking from a business and peace point of view about this issue. And then I'll have the opportunity really to pose a couple of questions to Alina to get some perspective from the ground on how businesses in our local network, Ukraine, not only are being impacted, but are reacting, and how the Global Compact is supporting work there. And excited she's able to join us and at very late time to share some of these perspectives and enhance the conversation. But the UN Global Compact is a special initiative of the United Nations Secretary General. It is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 15,000 companies operating in more than 160 countries. And then we have 69 local networks around the world that are a really critical part of the DNA of the Global Compact. And the basis of our work is around 10 principles in the area of human rights, labor rights, the environment, and anti-corruption. And these principles are all based on international standards and frameworks and conventions. And when a company joins and signs on to the Global Compact, at their highest level, they agree to aligning their operations with these 10 principles and to reporting annually on their progress. And in addition to supporting companies in responsible business conduct through these 10 principles, we also work to support partnerships with the UN system and to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And so really when we're thinking about this principles-based approach and thinking about business in conflict-affected areas, these principles are so relevant. In fact, they've never been more relevant, and they're as critical to the prevention of conflict as they are to the response. And so businesses have to think about taking action to ensure that their activities, and this means throughout their operations, their supply chains, their investment portfolios, are consistent with these principles and with international standards. And so Jenny and Kayla talked a lot about how businesses must support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights law and make sure that they're not complicit in human rights abuses. And I think you got a wealth of information and resources around that. So I'm not going to go too much into enhanced human rights due diligence and taking a conflict sensitive approach. But of course, this, as was emphasized, also includes protecting and supporting employees. And so companies really need to think about, if they have workers in the area, that they take all measures to ensure that their employees in affected locations are safe. And this means ensuring that whether or not they choose to withdraw or remain in Russia, that they protect their employees. I think one element that wasn't mentioned that's certainly a part of the 10 principles of the Global Compact is that this crisis is also a reminder of how corruption issues are central to any discussion here about the causes and solutions to geopolitical problems. And so this means that businesses must think about combating money laundering and the recovery of stolen assets, but mainly to ensure the transparency and integrity of the corporation and of their actions. And so I think while the 10 principles are guiding businesses to do no harm, business is also at a high risk in conflict-affected or fragile areas, but they can also provide the necessary economic investment, employment opportunities, inclusive development, and political capital that can positively contribute to not only the prevention of conflict, but to peace-building efforts. And to that end, I think when we think about some of these areas, we think about these concepts, or we can think about these concepts of negative and positive peace. And an environment of negative peace is one really with an absence of violence or an absence of the fear of violence, whereas positive peace is really about those elements that exist that maintain peaceful areas. And these are, lack of inequality, strong justice institutions, etc. And they're two sides of a coin, but they're equally important. And when thinking about positive peace, I think one of the frames that we can look for business is through Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And to that end, and I'll add this link to our chat shortly, we have developed a business framework that translates the various goals of SDG 16 for businesses and really calls on businesses to think about transformational governance. And this means really thinking about their role in reimagining the social contract and reinforcing public trust through not only their internal activities and making sure that they're accountable, ethical, inclusive, and transparent, but also applying those same principles to their external activities and ambitiously and proactively thinking about how they can strengthen public institutions, laws, and systems. So I'll put some of the links to these resources in the chat in a moment, but I'd like to turn it over now so we can get perspectives from Alina and learn a little bit more about how businesses are reacting on the ground. So Alina, we're so thrilled to have you from our local network in Ukraine. And I wonder if I could just open it up for you to share a bit about how businesses in the country or the region have been responding to the war, and if you see the Global Compact's 10 principles coming into play here when businesses are responding.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, and greetings from Kyiv. Unfortunately, there are no days here without sirens, but I hope it will be safer in this city soon. And thank you for this question. Businesses are very responsible to the crisis in Ukraine, I'd say, and most international businesses headquartered in the region support our country and allocate significant amounts to help civilians and armed forces. Many companies have left the Russian market, and a lot of them are on their way. And I highly respect this decision, and I'm grateful that they have done so. In April, President Zelensky called on entrepreneurs and businesses to return to normal and to develop Ukrainian economy. And despite the danger, the society united to defend Ukraine on all fronts, and including the economic one. And as a result, Ukrainian companies are transforming processes and helping as much as possible. Let me give you a sense of what I mean. We have developed our regular column, Business Battalion of UNGC. And here we highlight the best cases by companies that are our members and their recommendations for colleagues. So our member Bank, a part of BNP Paribas Group, told us that the group has set up a remarkable rescue and cover fund that have already donated more than 10 million euros to humanitarian organizations like UN, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, and others, and both their clients and employees involved in fundraising. And thanks to their efforts, there are more than 3.5 million euros have already been raised. Also, MHP, it's one of the biggest Ukrainian food producer. Their foundation, MHP Hromady, it is called like MHP to community, is working to provide Ukrainians with food. And their charity foundation fed more than 50,000 Ukrainian defenders. More than 20 food trucks were sent to the hottest spots in Ukraine, and more than 80 volunteer hubs were provided with food and packaging, and also more than 150,000 displaced Ukrainians were fed with their help. So Nova Poshta, it's one of the biggest logistic company in Ukraine. They transferred approximately $1 million to armed forces and moved more than 100 trucks and cars from its fleet to the needs of the military and volunteers. They also launched their humanitarian project, Nova Poshta Humanitarian. They deliver humanitarian goods worldwide. And Also, DTEC Group, they have provided more than 17 million in humanitarian aid and support the armed forces and territorial defense forces. They also helped to restore the energy supply for more than 120,000 families. Also, Intellius, our IT company, they have already collected $280,000 to the army, and they delivered a lot of cars to the front. Also, they are intellectual volunteers, and they joined a lot of initiatives where they provide logistic systems to the armed forces, and they help to search, purchase, and deliver the equipment. When we talk about 10 principles, I can say that the number of cases are enormous, huge, but here are just some of them. And all of the Ukrainian companies and international companies in Ukraine are very helpful, and we are very thankful for them for doing this. But when we talk about 10 principles, all of the cases align with them. 10 principles are guide in doing business even during this time of war. And according to our 112 network members in Ukraine, most businesses prioritize their team. So they continue follow labor factors, environmental, anti-corruption, and human rights. And when they are sure that they've managed to follow all of these principles, they focus on additionality and support our civilians, our armed forces. And I would like to remind that more than 16 million civilians were forced to relocate, and 15 million civilians have mental health problems caused by the conflict. So businesses are really helpful in this case, but they have so much work to do. And we are incredibly proud of our companies and wish them to recover as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Alina, for that. And I'm also going to put the link to the local network's website into the chat. But I appreciate your contribution and want to hand it over to the colleagues from Peace Nexus for the last 12 minutes or so of this panel.
We don't need to fill the full 12 minutes, but thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Jenny and Globescan, for inviting us to be part of today's panel. I think it's super important that we exchange the lessons we have and the conversations we are having with companies. I work for a peacebuilding foundation called Peace Nexus, and in addition to the programs we have in various fragile and conflict-affected countries, we are also an endowed foundation. So we have the opportunity to speak to the companies we are invested in, and as Peacebuilding Foundation, the topic on all our on our agenda with all the engagement meetings now is the war in Ukraine, and how can you best continue your operations in Ukraine? What can you do? Examples. What Alina already said, that companies are refitting some of their production facilities to be in support of the war efforts, but also what kind of support do you give to your staff members to be able to maintain their job while they need to join or they will join the army, but also how do you responsibly disengage from Russia. And I think in the coming months, years, we will see the companies that did so in a responsible, human rights informed way, and companies that did not get the right level of input into their decision making. And I think that's what we have seen historically, and I think that was also what Jenny was phrasing. Okay, what happened in the past? How did companies prepare for these situations in the past, and how can they actually contribute to building peaceful societies? So what we have seen is that companies that did conduct a human rights due diligence, did engage with their stakeholders in the ground before a crisis erupted are much better prepared. They know who to talk to. They know they are better prepared. They have conducted scenario planning, like what happens when a military coup happens? What happened when, well, I don't think anyone could imagine this to happen. But I think companies that did conduct human rights diligence did think about what kind of unintended use of their services could be, were much better prepared. And just to give an example of something we're currently involved in Myanmar, on a telco company that had to leave because they could no longer operate in the country according to their own standards, but also according to the international legal system. They assess the risk of when we need to leave, we leave behind a wealth of customer data. We leave behind a lot of information. We have the platform for people to communicate, like, but also now they can be prosecuted because of their ability to speak their minds on media and to call each other. So maybe beyond, like, how do you respond to a crisis? Companies can do a lot to contribute to peaceful and to peaceful societies and social cohesion. And maybe one thing I would like to start with is building on what's currently happening in Russia as well, that companies use their leverage to pull out of a country. I think a famous case historically has been on South Africa with the anti-apartheid, and one of the leading human rights investor collective, like the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and the coalition of faith-based institutions also started with that initiative. Okay, we need to create a global network of companies that speak out against apartheid and stop their trade with the company. I think there are instances where companies even do much more. They actually are part of peace processes. One well-documented example is in Northern Ireland, where in 1994, a group of companies under the Chamber of Commerce spoke out in favor of a peace agreement, and they facilitated various business roundtable discussions to advance the message, the pro-peace message. And that was an interesting situation where companies actually actively contributed to come to this peace agreement. And in Colombia, they have been closely involved as well in the discussions. I think one other thing I would like to spend a few minutes on, that's companies can also, by how they conduct their businesses, contribute both positively and negatively to conflict dynamics. And as a foundation, we try to capture some of that in what we call the Peacebuilding business criteria, and we'll put them in the chat as well, which are, okay, what kind of business processes should you be aware of when you're operating in fragile and conflict affected states? I think Jenny already mentioned the hiring practices. Who are you bringing into your company? Are you aware of the societal divides, and how inclusive is your hiring practices? I think you can really set an example as a company. But for everything, and I think I should have started with that, you really need to understand the context in which you operate. What are the conflict dynamics? How is my company influencing these conflict dynamics? How are these conflict dynamics influencing my company? And then you can really design your business processes that aim to contribute positively as well. So hiring practices is one. I think another one is, of course, the stakeholder engagement. You cannot operate in these markets without a meaningful engagement with your stakeholders, with your rights holders, that will help you to respond to situations, not only these massive crises as is happening now in Ukraine, but also to smaller social political events. Like how can you best respond to that? In order to do so, you need to bring in voices from society, and you need to have a platform to have these discussions. I think also what I find interesting, which is the marketing. What kind of marketing process do you have in place as a company? We have seen marketing that is really pro-peace. There was this like initiative of Coca-Cola that were enabled companies, that enabled consumers from Pakistan and India to communicate with each other when they bought a Coca-Cola. I think the Nespresso, their Coffee for Peace example is another one. But also on the flip side, there are examples out there, mostly like there are some historical events about beer companies that in their marketing further deepened already existing societal divides, like the gender stereotypes, etc. So you need to be aware, like, okay, what kind of messages is my marketing having on the communities that we operate? So maybe to give Jenny some few more minutes to come up with their concluding remark. I think the current tragedy that's happening in Ukraine is in that sense not unique. Companies are facing crises in other countries as well, and sometimes they say, okay, it's isolated events, like it's the coup in Myanmar happened, but we could never have seen that. The current crisis in Ethiopia, we could have not prepared for that. What's happening now in Ukraine and Russia, it really comes as a surprise. But I think if you look back historically, you know that these things could come your way if you operate in these fragile and conflict affected market. So conduct your appropriate human rights due diligence, conduct your scenario planning, speak to your stakeholders, and be prepared, because in the future I think we might be seeing more of these kind of major crises from happening. But I think companies can have a positive role if they like have the right business practices in place. But maybe let me stop there and hand it back to Jenny.
Thanks a lot, Johannes. I think we just have a couple more minutes, so just a couple of points that I want to make in closing. One is that the idea here is certainly not to discourage business investment in areas that are in conflict or at risk of conflict. We know that private sector investment is a really critical, perhaps the absolutely necessary factor in ensuring development and ensuring that basic needs are met around the world. And so the key here is really understanding what the context is, being prepared for crises, knowing who to engage on the ground to prepare for preventing and managing any adverse impacts on people, and then taking steps to conduct human rights due diligence so that harms are prevented and then remedied if and when they do occur. So we do really want to see businesses play a role in these areas, but in a rights respecting manner. I think with that, I want to say thank you so much to our friends at Peace Nexus, Johannes Schroeder, to our friends at UN Global Compact, Alina Konovalchenko and Michelle Breslauer, and of course, my colleague, Kayla Winarski-Green at BSR. Enormous thanks as well to GlobeScan, again, for organizing this event. We hope that everyone will take the opportunity to see what our friends and colleagues in Ukraine are doing and to support them in their efforts to protect the well-being of people there. Thank you so much.